it's important for the audience to not feel shortchanged by the end of a horror movie, or any movie, really, there's also always the potential for filmmakers to end up revealing too much for their own good. Sometimes less can be more, and by overwhelming the viewer with information and visuals, it can actually end up detracting from the impact of a scene or even the overall story. And that's absolutely the case with the following horror films. Perhaps they gave away the backstory of a classic genre villain who was better left mysterious, or showed something that could never live up to the image in our own minds, or simply got greedy and tried to get away with one plot twist too many. I'm Ellie for What Culture, and let's take a look at these horror movies that revealed too much. Starting with The Strangers Chapter 2. The entire point of the Strangers franchise is right there in the title. The antagonists are strangers who neither the victims nor the audience ever learn much about, and whose motives amount to nothing more than pure random sadism. The recent The Strangers Chapter 2 decided to toss this mantra away by offering up a wholly unasked for deep dive into the backstories of two of the masked killers, Pin-Up Girl and Scarecrow. Through laughable flashback sequences that reek of "we added this in reshoots," we learn that as a child, Pin-Up Girl beat another girl, Tamara, to death at school in a fit of jealous rage over her friendship with the boy who would become Scarecrow. Beyond needlessly pathologizing the villains from their youth, it also lent a totally pointless origin story to the Strangers' iconic catchphrase, "Is Tamara home?", which is revealed to be a knock-in game played by Tamara and Scarecrow at school. When a franchise is coming up with fresh nonsense like this, you know it's totally run out of juice. Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension. The genius of the earlier Paranormal Activity movies is that they weaponize the viewer's own imagination against them, forcing them to consider what the invisible demonic entity known as Toby might actually look like. But by the time we got to the series' 6th movie, Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension, the desperation was abundant between both the film's 3D presentation and its decision to finally show Toby once and for all. In The Ghost Dimension, the central family realizes that their old, modified video camera is capable of capturing entities, including Toby, who is envisioned as a black tendrilled humanoid figure throughout. But the worst is saved for the end of the movie, when the ritual is completed to transform Toby into a physical human. While the filmmakers expressed mild restraint in not showing Toby's face, the gangly lower torso of some dude just doesn't make for a remotely compelling or scary final reveal. Toby was so much creepier as an entity we never saw, and dropping the veil on his true form was, again, a pure desperation move to try and boost the box office of the series' not-so-final entry. Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is one of the most iconic and beloved horror films of all time, for damn good reason. But there's one scene that a lot of people take issue with: that damn dirty exposition dump. The climax reveals that the various murders have actually been committed by unassuming motel owner Norman Bates, who has a split personality resembling his own dead mother. But this is followed up by an overlong scene in which psychiatrist Dr. Richman fully explains Norman's illness in the most basic, spoon-feeding manner possible. Coming at the end of such a taut and well-crafted film, this exposition dump feels like a clumsy 5-minute lecture for the cheap seats. And while such mental health concepts were less understood by the audience in 1960, it's still way too much. Ideally, we should have cut straight to Norman listening to his mother's voice in jail and ditched this ham-fisted explanation entirely. Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers. There's no denying that the Halloween franchise was in full-on fatigue mode by the time its 6th entry, Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers, was released back in 1995. The better Halloween films have always clung to the notion that Michael Myers is a motivation-devoid merchant of death, a chilling personification of the fact that a sudden end can come for any of us at any time. But in an attempt to salvage the series' dwindling box office, the producers decided to finally explain it away. And so, The Curse of Michael Myers reveals that Michael is actually under the control of a cult, the Cult of Thorn, to be precise, which has placed an ancient druid curse on him, compelling him to try and kill his family on Halloween. This goofy, unsatisfying explanation ultimately robbed the shape of what little boogeyman mystique he had left, enough that both Halloween H2O and 2018's direct sequel to the original 1978 film quite mercifully erased this silliness from the continuity altogether. Cobweb. Cobweb is a classic example of a horror movie that got a little too overzealous with showing off its villain, despite clearly not having the budget to do it full justice. The film follows a young boy, Peter, who comes to believe that his parents have concealed his unwanted sister Sarah in the walls of the family home. It's taut stuff for about 80% of the movie's runtime. Before, in the third reel, we're introduced to Sarah in earnest, and more to the point, we're given an up-close glimpse of her. Sarah is a deformed woman with big piercing eyes and contorted limbs who moves around like a spider. Terrifying in theory, but the film's tight budget just couldn't land the execution. Rather than keep Sarah's entity hidden in shadow, ever a neat trick for lower budget horror filmmakers, we get a few too many glimpses of her up close, showing off the wonky VFX and less than stellar design work. This is to say, Sarah looks more silly than scary once we get a good look at her, when keeping her in the shadows would have maintained her creepy mystique. The Last Exorcism. The Last Exorcism is one of the better found footage films of the 2010s, in which Minister Cotton Marcus allows a film crew to document the final exorcism he will undertake, of a teenage girl named Nell Sweetser. It's implied that Nell is possessed and impregnated by the devil, but near the end of the movie it's revealed that Nell is in fact just a disturbed, traumatized girl who actually fell pregnant by a local boy. It's an interesting and unexpected ending which cleverly subverts many of the most tired exorcism movie cliches. But in a misguided attempt to send the popcorn-munching audiences home happy, that's not quite the end of the story. At the last minute, Marcus finds out that the local boy is gay and had no sexual contact with Nell, prompting Marcus to return to her home, where he finds an occult ritual happening during which Nell gives birth to a demonic creature. In the final scene, Marcus, his faith restored, runs towards the carnage, all while the remaining camera crew are all killed off. It's a trashy, lamely cynical note on which to end an otherwise brilliant film. An ending so tacked on as to unavoidably feel like a studio-mandated reshoot. Insidious. Insidious is one of the most popular horror films of the last 15 years, and is fondly remembered for the terrifying first glimpse audiences get of the lipstick-faced demon when he appears behind Josh in the middle of a scene. But as is so often the case in horror, overexposure risks robbing a terrifying villain of their fear factor, and that's exactly what happens in Insidious's third act. When Josh enters the purgatory realm known as the Further to save his son Dalton, James Wan gives us a more prolonged look at the entity. Observing him as he sharpens his claws and listens to Tiny Tim's tiptoe through the tulips, one might be more inclined to laugh than feel any sort of fear. All while those Darth Maul comparisons become all the more apparent. Less absolutely would have been more in this case, because combined with one's zany, roving shooting style, making liberal use of wide-angle lenses, it feels more like a marketing video for a Halloween haunted house than a genuinely eerie sequence from a major horror film. Death of a Unicorn. Death of a Unicorn is one of those frustrating horror flicks that just didn't realise its full potential, and this extends to finding a perfect end point for the story, and then just continuing on for a few more minutes. After the detestable shepherd is killed by a unicorn, and the unicorns harness their magic to revive a dying Elliot, he lovingly embraces his daughter Ridley. All is well and good then, only for this loyal reconciliation to be interrupted by the cops, who arrive on the scene and find Elliot and Ridley surrounded by corpses with no unicorns in sight. It's a hilariously bonkers, cruel twist ending on which to end the story, implying that father and daughter will be left on the hook for the deaths. But it actually continues for another scene, with Elliot and Ridley riding in the back of a cop car only for the unicorns to return and cause said car to crash, apparently helping them escape. It's not nearly as fun or punchy as the darker finale suggested moments earlier, and the actual ending also makes it seem like the unicorns either killed or horribly maimed the totally innocent cop who committed the grand crime of arresting 2 murder suspects. Lights Out. David F. Sandberg's Lights Out is a mostly strong expansion of his viral short film of the same name, which touts such an elegantly simple yet clever premise. Its supernatural entity, Diana, can only attack when the lights are off. For the bulk of the movie, Sandberg smartly enshrouds Diana in shadow, enough that we mostly just see her humanoid form stalking her victims. But near the end of the film, Sandberg does provide a glimpse at Diana's face, and you'll probably wish that he hadn't. Diana has such a generic monster face that you might be more compelled to laugh than scream. It adds basically nothing to the movie's finale, and honestly looks less scary than the more lo-fi version of Diana featured in the no-budget short. Ultimately, just leaving audiences to speculate on what she looked like would have almost certainly been far more effective than daring to confirm it. The Last Broadcast. For a solid 95% of its runtime, The Last Broadcast is one of the most chilling found footage films of all time, and one that actually premiered almost a full year before the Blair Witch Project popularised the burgeoning subgenre. Presented as a faux documentary, The Last Broadcast investigates the disappearance of a team of public access TV hosts while searching for the mythic Jersey Devil in New Jersey's remote Pine Barrens. It's sublimely creepy stuff. The film considering whether the team was murdered by a deranged member of their crew, or in fact they were offed by the state's legendary cryptid. But the big twist at the end of The Last Broadcast is that the killer is the documentarian himself, David Lee, at which point the perspective suddenly shifts to a third-person narrative style as he murders the data retrieval expert who has just deduced his identity. It's a wholly unconvincing twist which undermines everything leading up to it. Enough that the filmmakers should have probably just left the mystery unsolved rather than deign to cheap illogical shock value. Hannibal Rising. Hannibal Rising as a concept just didn't really seem all that appealing. Did we as fans really need a forensic, warts-and-all examination of how Hannibal Lecter came to be the world's most iconic cannibal? The 2007 prequel details Hannibal's traumatic youth, particularly the fact that his sister was killed and eaten by Nazi collaborators who later claimed that Hannibal himself unknowingly consumed her in a broth they made for him. As explanations go, it's just too tidy, for want of a better word, excessively pathologizing Lecter's penchant for human flesh in a deeply uninteresting way. Tellingly, franchise author Thomas Harris actually didn't want to write the Hannibal Rising novel, and only did so after being pressured by producer Dino De Laurentiis, who planned to find another writer to pen a Hannibal prequel if he didn't do it himself. That pretty much tells you all you need to know about how utterly inessential this story is and how little of true value it adds to Hannibal as a character. Drop. The recent horror thriller Drop tried to get a little too clever for its own good and ended up paying the price for it. The film follows a woman, Violet, who receives anonymous airdrop messages threatening her family while out on a date at a fancy restaurant. The person responsible is eventually revealed to be a fellow diner, Richard, who plans to assassinate her date, Henry. But even once Richard is dealt with, Violet needs to stop the masked man who has taken her son and sister hostage. Violet races home and engages the assailant, only for him to remove his mask in such ceremonious fashion as to suggest that we, the audience, should be shocked by the reveal. Though you couldn't be blamed for forgetting, considering how generic looking he is, the masked man is actually the guy who read Violet's electricity meter at the start of the film and gets all of about 10 seconds of screen time. It's a reveal that falls completely flat and makes it painfully clear that director Christopher Landon probably shouldn't have gotten greedy and tried to pull off an extra second twist. Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. We've seen Jason Voorhees unmasked plenty of times throughout the Friday the 13th series, with varying degrees of success. And by the time we got to the thoroughly reviled Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, it truly seemed like the filmmakers just didn't care anymore. Beyond the film as a whole, which mostly squanders the Jason in New York gimmick, when we see Jason's son's mask at the end, he looks absolutely horrible. Though Jason Takes Manhattan was by far the most expensive film in the series at that point, this was largely due to the location shooting, potentially meaning that there just wasn't enough cash left to give Jason the makeup job he deserved. And as a result, unmasked Jason looks like a goofy papier-mâché ape this time around, in stark contrast to the excellent, supremely badass maskless design he had in the previous film, Part 7, The New Blood. So laughable was the makeup this time around that it actively distracts from the film. And if the filmmakers couldn't pull it off to satisfaction, they should have probably just kept Jason masked up for the entire movie. The Gorge. Scott Derrickson's The Gorge is a pretty good movie that just doesn't know when to end. A sci-fi horror in which soldiers Levi and Drasser find themselves fending off the monstrous entities inside a mysterious gorge. In the third act, the pair attempt to escape human villain Bartholomew and avoid a nuclear detonation intended to sterilize the area. Levi and Drasser are ultimately separated from one another once the nuke goes off, after which Drasser spends 5 days in quarantine to ensure she hasn't been mutated by her trip inside the gorge, hoping to reunite with Levi on the other side of it. Levi doesn't materialize though, and ultimately assuming him dead, she moves on with her life, only for Levi to surprise her in France, where they share a crowd-pleasing smooch. But a little more ambiguity would have gone a long way here. Even if we knew for sure that Levi survived, a more restrained final scene in which Drasser simply turns to see him would have basically had the same impact without the corny romantic reconciliation. It Chapter 2. Adapting the bonkers finale of Stephen King's It is so damn tricky that they goofed it up twice. In King's novel, Pennywise the Dancing Clown's final form is revealed to be a giant spider, which, in the defense of both It adaptations, is an innately tough concept to get right. The 1990 It miniseries suffered immensely from its low budget, ensuring the spider prop looked comically unconvincing. But there was hope that Andy Muschietti's modern adaptation would use cutting-edge VFX to make Pennywise's spider far more persuasive. Ultimately, Muschietti proved to many that the Pennywise spider might be too difficult to execute in live-action form, given that his version more or less amounted to a larger Pennywise with elongated spider-like limbs. It looks better than the miniseries version, for sure, but it's still more silly than scary, suggesting that this is one of those concepts that might have been better off reworked into something else for a cinematic adaptation. Late Night with the Devil. While most movies on this list ended up showing too much at the tail end, Late Night with the Devil did the total opposite. The film opens with a surprisingly lengthy 10-minute documentary-style prologue detailing the life and times of beleaguered late-night talk show host Jack Delroy. Though well-produced and narrated by the brilliantly gravel-voiced Michael Ironside, the faux doc goes into an almost exhaustive amount of detail about Delroy's past, particularly the fact that he's been a regular attendee at The Grove, an elite camp for California's wealthiest men. When you couple that with the information about the cancer death of Jack's wife, Madeline, it gives a too early hint that something is majorly off with Jack. And so some viewers might even predict the eventual twist that Jack in fact made a pact with the devil at the Grove, trading his wife's soul for fame and success. Jack's backstory could have been more subtly unfurled over the course of the film, rather than laid out so blatantly up front, almost as though the filmmakers were anxious that audiences wouldn't get it. Opus. A24's Opus sees journalist Ariel invited to the secluded compound of reclusive pop star Alfred Moretti for a listening party of his long-awaited new album. However, it eventually transpires that, shocker, Moretti is operating a cult from the compound, culminating in him and his followers drinking poisoned champagne as part of a mass suicide ritual. Ariel just barely manages to escape and flees into the night. And that seems to be the end of the story. But an excessive epilogue is tacked onto the film, set 2 years later, where Ariel has written a book about her experience and pays a visit to an imprisoned Moretti, who in fact survived. Here it's revealed that the mass suicide was actually staged and all of the dead followers are still alive, having insinuated themselves into society at various levels to continue spreading Moretti's influence. And there's one more reveal. Moretti always planned for Ariel to escape, well aware that she'd write a book and inadvertently help propagate his message to millions of readers. It's all just too silly and contrived for its own good, really, and falls mostly flat as social commentary about our collective complicity in the fame of monstrous people. It really felt like the story was over when Ariel escaped, and the epilogue was a failed attempt to have its cake and eat it too. High Tension. Alexandra Aja's High Tension is an absolutely gut-wrenching slasher flick for about 90% of its runtime, as friends Marie and Alex find themselves chased down by a vicious serial killer. It's a brutally efficient, totally uncompromising outing for the most part, with strong performances, grimy visuals, and some insane gore effects, resulting in a movie that seemingly lives up to the promises of its title. But then comes that utter clanker of a twist when it's revealed that the killer is actually Marie herself, who is murderously obsessive over Alex and has been responsible for all the deaths in the film. Unfortunately, this calls into question pretty much everything we've seen in High Tension from Marie's dissociated perspective. And because there was basically no way for viewers to figure this out themselves, it ends up coming off as cheap and excessively manipulative. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the killer just being some random anonymous freak. And this twist is basically the epitome of pulling the rug out for pure shock value. And now, before our number one entry, know that major spoilers will follow for Black Phone 2, so if you haven't seen it yet, maybe stop this video here. Black Phone 2. Black Phone 2 is a decent, if relatively unnecessary sequel, which at least offered up a literally chilly new setting and reinvented the Grabber as a Freddy Krueger-esque dream-faring monster. But it's also a classic example of a horror sequel which needlessly over-explains its villain's past, while committing the most egregious sin of creating a convoluted link between him and our embattled heroes. Revealing that the grabber's first killing spree took place at Alpine Lake Camp in 1957 is one thing. But it's also revealed that Finney and Gwen's mother, Hope, didn't kill herself as they were led to believe. Rather, Hope, who worked with the grabber at the camp as a teenager, was actually killed by him, who staged her death to look like a suicide. This ultimately felt like a desperate attempt to raise the story's emotional stakes, as if the grabber isn't horrifying enough already. But just like Star Wars has proven so many times over the years, this everyone is connected brand of storytelling has a tendency to come off as lazy, forced, and woefully unimaginative.